after Parliament ratified the removal of Jammu and Kashmir's special status and splitting the state into two union territories, Prime Minister Narendra Modi gave a 40-minute address to the nation in which he justified the moves taken over the last 48 hours. Joining us to talk about the Prime Minister's address, the current situation in Jammu and Kashmir, and what the road from here is likely to be, I'm joined by Bharat Karnad from the Center for Policy Research and Michael Kugelman of the Wilson Center. Mr. Karnad, you heard what the Prime Minister said. He laid out the number of central laws that were not applicable in that particular state, and then tried to lay out for the citizens of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh what he set out as the vision he had for development in the state. Let me first get to that second part. To those that have lived under a security lockdown for the last few days, was this a convincing message?
Well, basically, I think the message that the Prime Minister sought to convey to the Kashmiri and Ladakhi people is that for the foreseeable future, in the interim, because the affairs of the two union territories are going to be managed by Delhi, things are going to be, it'll be a time to smoothen things out, to get new administrative structures in, to empower the officials there, and to bring in accountability by way of administrative measures and so on, to ensure that the programs that have been underway, and at least there on paper, the benefits of these reach the people on the ground. So, I mean, that's the sort of reassuring message the Prime Minister tried to convey to the people, that they need not be apprehensive about the new status that they enjoy within the Union, and in fact their lives are going to be so much better under the new dispensation than when under the 370 scheme of things. So I think this was a way to, in a sense, reassure and encourage people to think positively about their future.
Michael Kugelman, did that tone of reassurance come through from the Prime Minister's speech to the people that are from Jammu and Kashmir, to those that may disagree with the measure within India, and to the global community, in reaction to something that everybody thought happened rather abruptly and in a very quick period of time over the 2 days earlier this week?
Well, I think that it's true that the Prime Minister really tried to paint this decision as something that will really benefit people on the ground, because of better access to education and the fact that it will be easier to invest and do development in these areas. And I think that's true to an extent, but my sense is that, those on the ground in Jammu or in Ladakh would be a lot less concerned than those in the Kashmir Valley, who have really been particularly unhappy about the omnipresent or the presence of the states and the heavy-handed tactics that Indian security forces have carried out. And I think it's there in the Kashmir Valley where you have to worry about anger. And I think that these people will not be appeased by these promises of development, just because, again, for many of these folks, and I'm talking about Kashmiri Muslims in the Kashmir Valley, for them, their biggest grievance is not a lack of development. It's what they view to be the unacceptable, heavy-handed tactics of the Indian security forces. So I think that's where you could have the tensions, and I think it'll be a lot more difficult to win those people over, so to speak, than those in other parts of the region, in Jammu and in other areas. So what we'll see once India ends its lockdown, once the conditions ease in the valley, we'll see how people respond there. But I imagine that many will not be happy.
I'll come down to the specific grievances in the valley, Michael, in just a bit. Mr. Karnad, as the calibrated lifting happens off the current freeze that's there on communications and on movement, will there be a simultaneous stepping up in the challenges that the administration run by the governor faces? Could you list some of those?
No, look, I think once the controls go off, and the Prime Minister did not say anything about lifting these, shall we say, restrictions on the social media, the internet, and so on and so forth, because there's always a possibility that these mediums will be used to, in a sense, conflagrate the situation with all kinds of stories being, fake news and so on. So that is something that we cannot expect in the immediate future, that these restrictions will be lifted. And again, what was said earlier about the security forces there, the heavy hand and so on. Well, the reason they are there in the first place is because of terrorism and the separatist movement that the terrorists in fact have tried to further. So you can't then sort of confuse the cause for the whatever has come afterwards. The terrorism was there, the security forces followed to try to contain the terrorists and those outfits that have had local support. So the idea, I think, is with the development programs and so on that the Prime Minister is promising, that the government, the UT, under the UT dispensation, Union Territory dispensation, will try to distance the people from the terrorist outfits within whom the people have in a way supported, if not perhaps under coercion, because there are stories galore about these outfits coercing people into helping them out, assisting them in their operations and so on. Now that will, I think, will be sought to be ended by the security forces. So if there is a presence there, what there is will continue. And I don't think that's going to stop unless there are definite trends to where the people are seen to begin siding with the government and hurrying the development towards elections and popular rule, which is what, again, the Prime Minister promised. He said the Union Territory status is not permanent, that it will be, it will revert back to independent or separate state, provincial status for Jammu and Kashmir, and so on. So that's the kind of inducements the Prime Minister is holding out. The more you mainstream yourselves, the better it will be for you and for your development and for your prosperity.
Right. All right. On that point on election, Michael Kugelman, to address some of those grievances of those in the valley, the state came off a period of central rule in the mid-90s into that election of 1996, one that is considered amongst the most fair that had been held. And to compare that from that had been held in 87, which is seen as an event that vitiated the atmosphere and began that call for separatism. How far can an election that is held in the future, and if it is held to an exemplary level of fairness, will that go the distance in being able to make the people there feel that their voices are being heard adequately?
Well, of course, it depends. I think it depends on the constituency. Certainly, the more moderate elements within the communities in the valley may well be happy about the prospect of an election and ability to express themselves and have more of a direct hand in who their representatives are and who's in power. But I think for the hardliners, for the hardcore separatists, I really don't see them being deterred by the opportunity to vote in an election. I think that for them, they're uncompromising, and they simply do not want the state. They don't want the Indian state to be present, and that includes rejecting the notion of an election. And so, these irreconcilable elements will be much more difficult for India to work with, for sure, for the central authorities and for authorities in Kashmir to deal with. That will be a big challenge, I think, for New Delhi going forward. As it goes through this process of making India into a union territory, and making Kashmir into a union territory, as it tries to stimulate the investment and the development and the better education, all the things that are needed to make this region really work. Right. How much will the stability factor come into play? The threats from the separatists, and of course, Pakistan, I imagine, would be all too happy to try to exploit these uncertainties by trying to provide their own support and trying to cause problems on their own. So it's going to be a very difficult balancing act for Indian authorities.
I want to move to a round of questions on that very point, the balancing act and managing Pakistan, because we're also joined by Sarat Sabharwal, the former High Commissioner of India to Pakistan, on the phone line right now. Mr. Sabharwal, we've heard what the Prime Minister said. He set out an agenda of bringing the rest of India's laws to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, laying out a vision of development. What what was probably not something for a speech like this is managing the law and order in the state to keep out the elements that in part the state of Pakistan, the quasi and semi-state that has influenced separatism and terrorism in that region. In this mix, how does that get managed?
Look, we have to be very clear that Pakistan's terrorism was not linked in any way to 370 and, whatever has happened. That is determined by dynamics which are quite independent of the equation between the central government and Jammu and Kashmir within the Indian Constitution. Now, all those factors, are driven by the nature of the Pakistani state, the dominance of the army over the years, the forces that have been created, and they'll be determined by an independent set of factors. At the moment, they have the Financial Action Task Force scrutiny, but on the other hand, they are also trying to help the Americans exit out of Afghanistan. That gives them a little breather. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But
right.
I mean, we shouldn't assume that because we have done away with 370 and in our mind we have integrated the state even more closely with the Indian Union, that's going to end Pakistan's terror. That may surface at some stage. I'm sure they'll try and exploit the situation. Today, what I heard the Prime Minister do was to reiterate. He reiterated many of the points which the government had made in the parliament in support of the move, saying this had fed separatism, terrorism, and it was depriving the region of the fruits of development, that certain laws, he spoke of the right to education, minimum wages, etc., etc. And he tried to reassure the people about a bright future and good governance. And he also said that this whole thing of union territory was a temporary thing until, Kashmir came out of separatism, terrorism, and, was on the path to development, etc. The assumption being that then it could go back to being a state. All that is very well,
right.
But it will depend upon two things. One is how do people react? At the moment, there is a situation where there is a very tight control of the security forces.
Right.
Let's not forget that over the years, people in the valley have come to see 370, even though it was largely devoid by now of content because a large number of laws had been applied. But they had come to see it as a symbol of Jammu and Kashmir's special status under the Indian Constitution.
Right.
How would they react to its being taken away and Jammu and Kashmir being reduced to a union territory? Their political weight goes down. That we have to see.
Right.
And then, of course, all those assurances given by the Prime Minister.
Right.
Obviously, if even half of them are fulfilled, I'm sure that would have some impact on the situation.
I'll come to some of those in detail, Mr. Sabharwal. Give me 1 minute because I need to let Michael Kulmo go very quickly. My last question to you, Michael, was what do you make of the response that's come from Islamabad in the last 24 hours? The actions on trade, the actions on the movement of people that happened today, and the one yesterday diplomatically on downgrading and asking envoys to move back?
I think Pakistan's response was perfectly predictable. It clearly was very unhappy about India's decision to revoke 370, and so, understandably, it was going to respond in some way. And really, it responded with some rather risk-free moves. I mean, these moves that it made are not exactly escalatory. I mean, it is unfortunate that it recalled its high commissioner, but I think that these acts in and of themselves are not going to cause any escalation. I think what we have to worry about moving forward is if Pakistan tries to ramp up the responses to a point that you have to worry about escalation, such as, more intensive firing on the line of control or resorting to subconventional uses of force, such as by encouraging these India-focused terrorists on their soil to go into Kashmir and try to blow things up. That's where we really have to worry. But I think these responses that Pakistan took, they're predictable, and quite frankly, I think they're understandable, given how unhappy Pakistan is about this move that India has made.
Thanks, Michael. We will let you go. Mr. Karnad, elsewhere in the Indian state and over the last 70 years, whenever movements of local internal uprisings have occurred, we've had over a period of time a window for those that have indulged in that activity to give up arms and move towards representation, be that in areas that were left affected in the center of the country or those areas in the northeast. Given that this move in the last 2 days leaves very little room for the separatist elements, how does that get neutralized over the coming months and years?
Well, look, I think the Prime Minister did say that, and he pleaded with the youth of Jammu and Kashmir as one unit and of Ladakh on the other, that they should come forward and form a new slate of leadership to take over the duties from the older generation. In fact, he asked for such a new leadership to come to the fore. The whole point is people like Gilani and others, these are, shall we say, terminal separatists. They're not going to give their cause up for love or money or anything else. So, and they're going to be marginalized. I mean, they more and more, if you realize what's happened, the Indian state has come down. They've got, their financial support has been cut off. The financial support they used to rely on from Pakistan and so on has been pretty much cut off. Their access to the Pakistani High Commission will now be terminated. More and more, they'll be just restricted to their little compounds without any kind of police protection. So you're going to find them, if they are not already there, in a terrifically paranoid situation where they'll have to worry awfully much about their own security, because the state is not going to look out for them because they are, after all, undermining the state. Okay. So the state has no obligation whatsoever to protect these separatists. So this is the sort of message, I think, that's going through. And of course, this doesn't really include the more established parties like the National Conference or the PDP, who will be encouraged to see the light, as it were, to get back into the mainstream, reconcile the best they can to the changed circumstances, and to get back into politicking, but more honest politicking, without the corruption and the rest of the thing that has always been a trait of the PDP and the National Conference governments in Srinagar and Jammu. So that's going to change. They will be held accountable. And I think the people, once they realize under the Union Territory dispensation and so controlled by Delhi, after things are cleaned up, the administration is spruced up, that the people will see the benefits, and a new level of expectations will then be, in a sense, embedded in the polity that will evolve, that will come through after a period of time of adjustment. And generally, I think even the established parties will have to then up their game, and it will not be the same old faces, the same old dynastic families and so on, asking for support on the same old basis of Sheikh Abdullah and this, that and the other. So there'll be new metrics, really, electoral metric that will be, whether anybody likes it or not, willy-nilly be injected into the political mainstream of Jammu and Kashmir on the one hand and Ladakh on the other.
Mr. Karnad, I want to come to the political metrics that you just mentioned, but give me one point to go to back to Mr. Sabharwal, something that I had asked the early panelists before. How is this message carried to the rest of the world, Mr. Sabharwal, and in specific pockets? There have been at previous times when developments have happened in Jammu and Kashmir, Pakistan's approach, the organization of Islamic states. Is that something that India needs to manage? The management of this and what's happened the last 3 days with China, with the United States, and in parts of Europe, knowing and assuming perhaps that the Russian state right now is assumed to be on the side that India and the stance India has taken. How does this and what's happened and what's communicated by the Prime Minister to his own country get communicated to the rest of the world?
Well, we should be quite clear that managing the international dimension is not a problem. You have seen that the reaction has been very muted. Such reaction has been there. The Chinese have confined it largely to Ladakh. where they have claims, and then generally ask the two countries to maintain, peace. This is largely the American message that we have seen. So that is not a problem. Pakistan's reaction, also the steps taken by them, are largely symbolic. Nothing that we cannot live with, nothing that we cannot manage. So I don't think that is an issue. I'm sure our embassies around the world will be given briefings. I'm sure they have already been briefing, influential countries. I'm sure it will go around to all the countries concerned. Our embassies will brief them about Prime Minister's message. In any case, I don't think we need to worry too much about. With India standing today, we can withstand any pressure. In any case, I don't see any pressure coming. Pakistan taking it to the UN Security Council, I don't think they will get much traction there from any country, let alone influential countries. That is not the issue. The issue is how do we manage the situation internally. That is something which needs even greater focus than the external dimension, I would say.
All right. On those internal dynamics, my final question back to you on Bharat Karnad on the political matrices that you mentioned earlier. One point struck me as slightly odd, which I want to take your view on. In projecting the virtues of central rule, the Prime Minister seemed to suggest that once the state came under governor's rule, the administration of the state improved significantly in the last year and a quarter, forgetting the fact that the alliance that ran the state in the 4 years before that, the BJP was a major participant in it. So whenever the state goes back to the people, it's not like the Prime Minister made the case that the BJP in alliance with somebody ran the state well.
Well, yeah, there was a little bit of skating on thin ice there, simply because the BJP and the PDP were in coalition. But those who, just about everybody reported this, so it's no great state secret. But the fact that the coalition partners were at odds with each other. One of the reasons why very little governance of any kind happened is because they were at an impasse. And each side would, in a sense, veto the other's initiatives and so on. So nothing came about, and that led to the kind of situation where the central government had to step in. So that is in the past. I think the thing to look forward to is, the possibility that the central government now will deal in a dual fashion with the political opposition in J&K, in particular, the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir, which is to deal with a sort of, kid gloves with established parties and those elements within even the separatist fringe that want to rejoin in a more open and overt fashion the open electoral kind of politics. Right. And then the Gilani types who are, as I said, terminal separatists who will not budge from their historic and traditional position, and they'll be treated in a manner to entirely sideline them to the extent that the state can manage, and they will be pretty much dealt pretty harshly with in that sense. On the other hand, PDP and the National Conference will be compelled, I think, by circumstances about the new kind of measures being brought in, new forms of governance, results being shown on the ground, etc. They'll be compelled to change their ways and not to act as they have done for the last 70-odd years, where they cornered all the goodies and very little, and they sort of cornered the goodies for themselves as families and for their immediate followers and sycophants, while leaving the people pretty much up in the air. Right. So that will change willy-nilly. Okay. And I think that's the kind of metric the people are going to use to judge whether or not to elect this or that slate of politicians will be up for elections whenever these are announced.
All right. Fair enough. A lot of work remains to be done to bring a brighter future to the people of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, which are now 2 union territories. Thank you, Bharat Karnad, Sharat Sabharwal, Michael Kugelman, to give your views on what's been a historic week in India's parliament, the consequences in one of its largest states, and Prime Minister Modi's first address to the nation in his second term. Thank you for watching.